Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. So this is part one of a two-part series looking at reimagining resourcing of social transformation. Looking at the ways that we resource movements, that we resource social justice work, that we resource civil society. And there has always been a whole section of nonprofit finance. And thinking of things like the Nonprofit Finance Fund or in the United States and many other institutions globally who have seen their role as providing financial support, not the revenue, not the grants and the gifts, but the financial systems that support organizations to navigate. Now, we started looking at this a couple years ago. This topic actually came up for us in part because of our long-term partnership conversations with the Equality Fund. And so the Equality Fund and Criterion imagined this webinar that we were going to do a few years ago looking at endowments. Because endowments are one way that you can stabilize an organization, create long-term revenue, and the role the Equality Fund has played is to actually stabilize a steady grant making out to women's rights organizations. And so we started with this, but having just a conversation about what the Equality Fund has done with their endowment and sort of shining a light on some of the choices that they've made felt a little tone deaf in the context of this moment today in April 2025, where funding has just been upended. And so we paired that with a conversation about different approaches to resourcing. How do we think about the ways that finance can play a role, not necessarily in providing the revenue, but ensuring the effectiveness of that revenue, ensuring the stability of the organization in lumpy revenue times, all these different financial management tools that finance can help with. And so this part one, looks at how do we bring a feminist financial imagination to some ideas? What are some insights about what might happen? Before I walk through some of those insights, we pulled an extraordinary reflection that our colleague Yifat Susskind had on a webinar that we hosted recently. So we'll begin with her reflections on why a feminist financial imagination is important right now, and then continue on to some of the insights that Criterion's been working on around reimagining resourcing for social transformation. Part two, we'll look at endowments themselves. We'll have a conversation with the Equality Fund about what they've learned from rolling out their endowment structure and reflect on this paper that we've written about power dynamics within endowments. So that will be part two, coming out soon. Enjoy.
For 23 years, Criterion Institute has revealed new possibilities for how finance can be used for systems change. Our progress has been deeply rooted in the partnerships we've built, partnerships with people willing to use their power to challenge the status quo and accelerate change. We simply couldn't do our work without them. On the 14th of May, we invite you to join us for Insights and Invitations, where current and prospective partners meet others doing complex systems change work and expand their imagination about how finance might be used for change. To find out more, visit criterioninstitute.org.
Just a quick introduction to Yifat Susskind, who's been a friend for many, many years. Inviting you into this conversation, Yifat, just because we've been talking about this for, I think we tried to add it up a bit ago, but nearly 20 years. in one way or another. And so maybe within this, why do you think we need a feminist financial imagination right now? What is your sense of why that's important at this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. I'm really happy to be in this conversation with everybody. And just for those of you who don't know MADRE, we work as a feminist fund and human rights organization with groups in the global south in crisis, feminist-led organizations. And so we've are in some ways used to being in crisis, but in other ways, as you know, people based in the U.S., some of what we're going through right now is also new. So, and we've not, as an organization, engaged that much intentionally with systems of finance in the way, for example, Equality Fund has. So I'm coming to this conversation, like many of you, with a very sort of like with a lot of questions and a kind of like exploratory stance, but I'm here because I have always been like really captivated by the way that Joy and the Criterion Institute kind of like reimagine like systems of finance, and what you were saying before, Joy, about like that, about it being a way to think about the future we want, which is the work of feminist movements also. So
So
you
what
know,
changed for you now, Yifat, right? So we've had these conversations for years and you've said, it's nice, Joy, but not my priority, and very nicely always, and in friendship and dialogue. But what changed for you? Why now? Because I know independent of this thing, you're actually focused on this right now and thinking about it in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, you know, I think for me it's about like the moment that we're all facing, right? I think every single person on this call could speak to the flaws and contradictions of engaging with philanthropy, but it's also like a system that we know and we've learned, many of us, to turn to our advantage over the years and make it do what we needed to do, even with the frustrations, right? With those flaws and contradictions. And the reality is that like that system is not working for us right now. It is breaking down. And I think we have sort of like reached the outer limits in lots of ways of like what philanthropy will do, can do, you know, not just because of the economic downturn, um, but because certainly progressive philanthropy, at least in the US, is very much under attack by the state. I think, you know, there's some private foundations that will resist. There was a bit of a bright spot today. I don't know if people saw the nonprofit quarterly publication of the call for solidarity by MacArthur and some other big private funders. So that's a bright spot. But in general, philanthropy has been a bit of like a deer in the headlights since the Trump government came in. And I think, like a lot of other liberal institutions under fascism, lots of parts of philanthropy will cooperate and stop funding anything that's deemed oppositional, and that includes like the work of everybody on this call. So, we need some new ways to finance our work, and I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater and give up on philanthropy. Like we still need that, and it will continue to be important. But we need some new ways to think about like how we leverage systems long term, right? And it's not that, you know, we can flip a switch and suddenly systems of global finance will be funding sources for feminist movements. But I think we have to be able to do what we know how to do as activists, which is to act like short term and long term simultaneously. So short term, yeah, like we need to keep our work funded. We need to do some triaging in this moment. We need to organize amongst ourselves and amongst our donors. And we need to think like big and long term about like what's going to be better than the system that we have been relying on so far. And we might need to be able to do that, not just in terms of funding, but not just outside of philanthropy, which is important, but we might need to be able to function also like outside of the structural dependency that we've created on states, right? That manifests in, you know, mandatory NGO registration, and in the States and some other countries, tax exempt status connected to the work that we do. So, yeah.
So one of the things you brought up, one of the things you brought up in the midst of that, just to dig in a little bit more, is the the systems of philanthropy and certainly the systems of state governments don't act independently from the broader systems of finance. I think the illustration of the sort of decline in assets of foundations that happened overnight in the last night, the night before, and the night before, actually show that systems of philanthropy have never been separate. And this is where Equality Fund is sort of a transparent and explicit example of that. They've never been separate from systems of finance, right? The ability for a foundation endowment to be able to give out grants is solely dependent on the success of the capital markets. And that interdependency means that there is more ways to think about that, right? But it's I don't know, in some ways it's safer to say we'll just deal with the philanthropy that comes out of that process, but not look at the broader piece of how foundations sit within the broader capital markets.
Yeah, that's right. And I think in a lot of ways, we've created a kind of a sort of like false dichotomy. Like, as you're saying, like philanthropy is part and parcel of like global capitalism and financial markets. And yet somehow we've created like a story inside of the global women's movement that philanthropy is good because those are our allies, and and capital markets are bad because that's part of capitalism. So I think it's I think that's on us to kind of reframe for ourselves, and this is a moment, like the financial crash in 2008 and others, where what you said becomes really, really salient. Like, yes, it is one system. And so I think that we can rely on our own like feminist principles and also on our political savvy to be able to navigate systems of global finance the same way we have had to do with philanthropy, to not allow either co-optation or like compromise of like our values and our goals. Like, that's important to do no matter where we're, sourcing like money from.
Thanks. This is really helpful. Any final thoughts? Otherwise, we'll move forward and keep this going. But thanks so much for starting us off.
I just want to say something about like that your offering of like feminist financial imagination, because I do think that like as activists, that imagination is like our superpower, right? Like, that is actually the source code for every single thing that we do, because if we're trying to create a just world, we have to be able to first like imagine something that never has fully existed. And so I feel like we are used to thinking about that in our programming and less used to thinking that way in how we finance our work. But that's I think, as we're like moving through this crisis and like certain systems are collapsing and breaking down, that's really dangerous. And we do need to like protect people, protect work, treat it as a threat and a danger. But it's also like this amazing opportunity, because that system that's collapsing was not that great of a system. And so like, as we protect people and protect work, like what can we build up instead? And I think that the starting point to that question is like having the discipline to dream together and do this imagining.
In the wake of the Trump administration shutting down U.S. aid and a general attack on DEI, let alone feminist agendas globally, there has been an increased attention to the funding for that movement. How do we fund the work that is about women's rights, that is about building a feminist movement, that is about expanding voice and shifting power? I will say this is not really a new conversation. I was privileged to be at a gathering in South Africa in November with a group of feminist organizations. And I will say the core topic of the conversation during that time was also the lack of funding in that case because of shifts in a few foundation priorities. Criterion has always sought to partner more deeply with women's rights organizations and the feminist movement. Our stance on gender lens investing is that it is weakened because it does not have the expertise, the experience, the analytical frameworks, the things that come with working on complex gender issues that one would find in people who work on those issues every day. And so we have always worked to integrate more, not just gender experts, but a broader part of the feminist movement into the field of gender lens investing. One of the hardest parts about that, though, is the immediate question as we invite somebody into a conversation about gender lens investing, where the response almost immediately is, will this enable me to fund my organization? And I truly and profoundly understand that experience of scarcity, of needing funding, of not being able to have the space to engage in a new field. But it does mean that it has been harder to cultivate what we would describe as a feminist financial imagination inside of the broader feminist movement. And so a couple years ago, we actually hosted a conference called A Feminist Financial Imagination, bringing together these two words, really thinking about both a feminist imagination and a financial imagination. And how do we bring those two together so that we can think about ways to use finance to address deep structural inequities, but also potentially ways to use finance to increase the equity or potentially even the efficiency of organizations that work on feminist issues, women's rights issues. And so it's that second piece that I want to focus on today, which is looking at what are the ways that the systems of finance can be used to support grassroots organizations, civil society organizations, organizations working on social justice. In some ways, whether or not they're feminist or not, this was just the conversation that we've been having recently. And what are the ways that we can use systems of finance to support those organizations? And so this maybe starts with what finance can do. So we've been thinking about this a lot in preparation for this webinar that we had recently with a quality fund. And so a couple of the things that started that off is to say, finance at an organizational level, it can do four things. It can reduce risk for the organization, in some ways by sharing that risk with an investor or with somebody else who is willing to take on some of that burden. The second is you can extend time horizons. Time is so critical in organizations making decisions. Do I have the time to develop a new program? Can I last the time that it takes between a commitment to receive funding and when I actually get the check? Those kinds of questions, sort of the moment of when we make decisions based on scarcity, that's most often driven by time, right? That we have a choice where we could make a more abundant decision, but we don't have the time to do it. We're running out of funding. We're running out of runway, whatever that might be. And so finance can extend time horizons. The third piece is it can increase adaptability. So if you want to be able to pivot in the response to a crisis, if you want to pivot as a result of an opportunity or an innovation, finance can provide that kind of capital that allows for that pivot. And so what each of these are doing is it does not necessarily increase in each of these things that financial vehicles can do in the context of civil society nonprofits. None of these will increase how much funding you actually have necessarily. In the end, it's investment, so it needs to get paid back. But it can increase how effectively you use the funding that you get. Right? If I'm making a short-term decision about how to move forward priorities and I need to lay off staff because I don't quite have the funding yet, and it would have been way cheaper to keep the staff that I have, keep them engaged for just 2 months more, but I don't have that time. I don't have a window of time. I don't have the ability to last that long. Those kinds of decisions affect the effectiveness of our existing funding. Finally, and I do say this a lot, I believe that one of the most amazing things about finance is that it can, and it does not always, but it can foster a belief in a more hopeful future. In the end, what we do in finance is make bets on that future. So being able to tell a story of a hopeful future in the context of today, where so many organizations are shutting down. And if you go to a philanthropist right now and say, help my organization survive, their question, reasonable or not, is, but are you going to survive? I'm only going to bet on you if I think you're one that's going to survive. And so being able to name those conditions of a hopeful future to say, damn right, you should bet on me because this is the future that's possible. Investments provide that kind of story of the future. It's almost required, right? I've said this a million times, but finance requires a future. Nonprofits are often analyzing the problems of the present, not necessarily looking out to the future. So reduced risk, extended time horizons, adaptability, and then a belief in a hopeful future. But the ability to do this really comes back to the idea of a financial imagination, the ability to have a mindset that facilitates the formation of new ideas, that thinks about alternative futures or uncovers possibilities. And then how do we use the power, the tools of financial systems to be able to advance the justice that we seek? So as we were playing this out in the context of this, trying to think of a word that's not cursing, this current context that we sit in, we came up with some ideas. And these are really meant to be brainstorms. So trying to think about what are the possible ways that in the response to this moment, we can use finance to create those futures. So a couple ideas. First of all, starting with cash flow. So how do we optimize cash flow, which is, again, the key time dynamic where you might have the revenue, but you don't have the cash. And so how, if you have the revenue, can you get cash? Because the two don't always tie together. You might have a commitment of funding, 90% real or 99% real, but you don't yet have that cash. Or you have, let's say, a contract with a government that is reneging on that contract, but you have the possibility that they will pay you back. And this is where you can share risk with an investor. So essentially, receivables financing converts future expected income into immediate working capital, right? So taking anticipated grants, donations, contract revenue as collateral and allows organizations to access funds before they actually receive the capital. So this can allow for more strategic planning, more financial confidence as you bridge funding gaps, or allow for a quick response to an emerging opportunity, right? In the midst of the doom and gloom of the moment, if something shifts and there becomes a new possibility, the ability to galvanize and respond to that can also be a purpose for financing. and particularly this receivable financing. So what's cool about this is it's basically saying, I know I'm going to get this money. Can you give me money now so I can get that money later? Now, to be clear, this is investments, right? So they are sharing risk with you, which is why an investor would expect to be paid for sharing that risk in some way, whether it's interest on a loan or a kind of discounted receivables. Often what happens is you'll get 85% of the money because somebody took a risk that you're not going to get the whole amount. So again, shared risk comes with a cost. The second piece is actually another strategy that works on cash flow optimization, but a little bit more from a shared risk perspective. So if there is earned income, right, there's a strategy where you believe that a new direction will create new revenue. It is possible to do what's called revenue-based financing, which aligns repayment of the financing with actual financial or income capacity. And it works with some of the variability in operations within organizations that have very clumpy revenue. It can also respond to the needs that are arising from opportunities. And so it doesn't necessarily take the organization into debt to explore a new opportunity, because if the new opportunity doesn't come into being and there isn't any revenue, then you're not obligated to repay the money. That's the shared risk. If this doesn't work out, if there isn't revenue, then so be it. And so it does actually foster a kind of collaboration between women's rights organizations or civil society organizations and investors by demonstrating that capital is available when the opportunity arises. And if that opportunity doesn't pan out, then you won't be penalized. And so it's an interesting model of really, this has become very popular in impact investing and more socially investment models, because it's tying that tangible revenue with the investment returns. And so if the revenue doesn't ever show up, you're not on the hook. Obviously, variations on that with all kinds of different terms. So that's sort of looking for cash flow optimization. One other piece that we looked at was really thinking about ecosystem consolidation, right? We talk all the time. There's lots and lots of small nonprofits. And maybe there should be. Any nonprofit that wants to stay small and wants to stay independent should be able to. But we've often struggled with ways to do things like pooled reserve funds. And actually, a friend of mine and I were talking about this last year, where in the span of a couple weeks, I asked to borrow some money from her, and then she asked to borrow some money from me. And it became a little bit of, what if we actually had pooled reserve funds? As an organization, we've struggled to build reserves as an individual organization. But could it be a kind of dedicated financial reserves across several organizations that provide a financial buffer for unexpected challenges, or, again, an opportunity based on strategic investments? And so it's continuity during crisis period, which is what having cash in the bank enables you to do. But there are so many organizations where it is a long time before they're going to be able to have cash in their bank accounts that they don't have to touch for operations day to day. But again, having a pooled reserve fund allows multiple organizations to tap into it and, of course, repay it, right? So we're not just pulling revenue, we're not just pulling out capital to serve as revenue, but rather to float until we get to revenue that we have on the horizon, or until we can pay it back in whatever way. So the pooled reserve fund would only stay a reserve if all of these organizations were reinvesting the money that they took out and putting it back in. Second piece, which is maybe a little more permanent, is looking at thoughtfully financed mergers. I think there's lots of places where people want to collaborate and in fact see that there might be synergies between the two organizations. But restructuring is challenging. The possibility of moving through a merger can be complicated. And so in a sort of thoughtfully financed merger, not thinking about, the tycoons of sort of M&A that are, stripping companies for their parts. That's not what we're talking about here. But thinking about where are the ways that we can finance a merger, because in the end, there are cost savings that come out of that. That means the investor who financed it can be repaid through those reduced costs in the future. And so that increased flexibility in resource allocation, maybe looking at the collective power of feminist organizations, all of those could be enabled through a financing structure that sort of paves the way for those kinds of mergers. And again, nothing to be forced, and not what you want to make sure, and I've always thought you want to make sure that you're not just going to be poor together, right? That there is some added value or a decreased cost through coming together. And it's that added value or decreased cost that is financeable. And again, you could say, well, why don't foundations just give us grants to do this? And I'm going to keep saying, great. If you can get grants to cover these costs, by all means, and there are organizations who would fund it. What we're trying to bring, though, is a broader financial imagination to say, could this open up other types of capital? Now, shifting a little bit to some investment strategies that might actually generate revenue. So in general, many people are looking for financial solutions that say, if I had an endowment, I would have investment returns. Well, if you had an endowment and you had investment terms last week, you just lost a whole bunch of the value in your endowment. And so what are some of the ways that we can have income generated from investments that's not an endowment betting on the stock market? So one is to think about what else you can own. So community-owned economic models. One of the ideas was thinking about a feminist REIT. It's an acronym of a REIT. So a real estate investment trust. I got it. REIT. And so these are co-owned or operated income-producing real estate or pooled rent, right? So it's sort of thinking about a long-term trust where property is owned and that collectively people could own that property, think about the rents that are generated out of it or other ways that real estate can produce income, including simply increasing its value. And property is a really stable asset class compared to an endowment that's invested in the stock market, for example. And so it's an interesting way of looking at collective ownership of land or of infrastructure, which gets to the other idea, which is thinking more about intellectual property. So how do we co-own intellectual property that could then be licensed and could create revenue? And again, thinking about this not just as an individual organization going out and saying, I'm going to go sell my intellectual property, which often as an individual organization is frankly just unrealistic, almost always. And people are not built as a business. They're not able to do that. But are there ways that collectively owning intellectual property could be invested in and then could create income over time? And so it does think about ways that you can reclaim value for cultural labor, right? The work that it takes to create all of these things. What's the income generation that can come out of it? But rather than every individual organization going out and selling that, are there ways to build sort of feminist intellectual property platforms where things are co-owned? So playing with this a little bit also takes us to alternative currencies. So two that come to mind, one is sort of thinking about time banks. And again, time banks work in some contexts, they don't work in others, but it is a way to differently value the currency of time. It shifts what currency we're talking about, right? So rather than thinking only about money, cash, as the currency we're trading in, how can we think about time? The other thing that's emerging is something called a care coin, sort of thinking about the ways in which we can earn within an ecosystem based on the care provided, valuing care. I'm hearing this over and over again. And by recognizing and rewarding care and activism, it sort of reaffirms the worth of this movement labor, sparking belonging. But again, there needs to be an ecosystem of people willing to pay for that care and a way to think about what that value creation is. But it does separate. Maybe alternative currencies are trying to step away from extractive markets. And then there's a possibility to say, can we build an alternative currency that's more grounded in feminist principles? Which takes us to blockchain. Again, feminist financial imagination. These are, they're not all ideas that are going to be working. Who knows if these are going to work? But they're sparking ideas. What's possible? I'm not saying it's all doable. And I'm certainly not saying I would bet on all of these by themselves, but there are ways to imagine different ways. So one of the things is looking at a DAO, which is a form often of sort of thinking about a mutual aid DAO. What DAOs do is they use blockchain to be able to digitally coordinate how funds move. And in that, you can be much more directive and much more transparent on what basis funds move. So tools can automate disbursement, it can reduce overhead, and it can build this kind of sense of financial sovereignty that I control this money with others, and transparently. So there's lots of people working on how to build DAOs that are really grounded in community. Warning though, there are also a whole bunch of DAOs that are one big con job. This is a tool that doesn't work unless we really look at it. But it does allow us to move capital in different ways and potentially respond to the needs of different organizations based on transparent criteria. So continuing along that path, there are many different ways to think about how money moves more transparently. And in this case, we are really talking potentially about a set of grant dollars, a set of revenue that sits there. But the question is, on what basis is it dispersed and who gets to control those decisions? So blockchain is one of those tools that can add to that transparency, can shift power dynamics. It's not the only thing. There's all kinds of other ideas that do that same thing. One final idea, which is thinking about investing for the long view. In some ways, what all of these ideas would require is that somebody put together a clear picture that says, working in this way, building towards justice, is long-term the direction we're moving in. One of the questions we've been asking all the time at this moment is the pushback that we're experiencing, at least in the United States and then spilling onto the rest of the world, is that pushback a backlash to progress that we've made, or is it really a shift towards increased racism and misogyny? And. If it's a backlash, then you can predictably say there will be a backlash to the backlash, and so on and so forth. But it is about putting out a picture of the future. What, again, coming back to the point of investments is to say right now, it might not look good. But if you are looking carefully at how you're investing, if you're seeing different futures, if you're naming those different futures, then it justifies the risk today. So thinking about often what an investment, we'd call that as an investment thesis. What is the hopeful future that we are betting on that creates a long-term investment? We're talking 10, 15, 20 years. And so then what are the flexible, extended time horizon capital deployment strategies? How do we deploy capital with a really long view to say how it is repaid might actually take some time? And in some ways, this is what bonds do, right? They say that there's some change, and social impact bonds were a variation on this, of saying there's a future change that we're betting on, that if we invest in now, we get to that future. And in doing this, can we create more innovative organizational models, build more resilient financial ecosystems that allow us to navigate what will continue to be complex economic landscapes? So in the end, the core of all of this is to think about, what do we bring to a feminist financial imagination? If we imagine different futures, we think about different ways to share risk, we figure out ways to get away from the tyranny of time, and do that with mutuality, do that in community, do that together, not individually, and creating more connected, more integrated systems. And at some level, while there are extraordinary evils and harm that have been created from the financial systems that exist, there are also tools within that are known and understood and trusted and can be applied to our world. We have to tweak them. We have to look at them carefully. We have to look at why they work the way they work to make sure that we're going into this eyes wide open. But there are alternative strategies, and they're worth exploring.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.